Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show for Fréttin.is and with Gústaf Skúlason and the host Margrét Friðriksdóttir. We have now been honored to have a very special guest with us, Douglas Macgregor. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel, government official, author, consultant, and political commentator. Yeah?
It's close enough.
Close enough. I found this actually in Wikipedia, so maybe I guess you're much more. So very welcome. And yeah, very welcome, Mr. Macgregor. Are you there, Gústaf? Are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Unfortunately, my camera is not working now. So, we are together with Mr. Macgregor, and thank you very much, Douglas, for joining us and taking your time for us. We are from Iceland, Margrét and I live in Sweden. We would like to. I see you have now are leading for a new movement in the United States of America, our country, our choice. Could you tell us what is going on in the United States today?
That's a question that deserves a very long and complex answer. I can't tell you about everything that's happening in the United States, but I think that we are in a crisis much like many European states. And this crisis involves our existence as a nation state, our national identity, our national culture, our national purpose. All of those things are at this point up for discussion. And at the same time, we find that we are committed to a number of potential conflicts and wars around the world, most of which Americans know nothing about and would prefer not to be involved with. So that's one of the reasons that we founded Our Country, Our Choice, because so many Americans said, look, it doesn't make any difference who we vote for. We end up with the same bad policy outcomes again and again. So we want change. We want an end to these wars. We don't want to be committed to potential conflicts that we haven't carefully examined. You know, our national interest is really hostage to the interests of other countries. And that's not a position we want to be in. We want to protect our borders. We want to secure our borders. We want to stop this massive invasion of people we know nothing about coming into the southern border by the millions. We want to restore our republic, the rule of law, crack down on the rising criminality in our cities. All of these things are what we are about. And I think that's what I just described is on the minds of most Americans right now. The last thing that is on anybody's mind is Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine. And people don't really understand the seriousness of the situation in the Middle East right now. We're very focused at home, very focused on what's happening in our world in the Western Hemisphere. Does that help?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, Margaret, sorry.
Yeah, so are the American people, you find it they're like awakening, is awakening now in America concerning about the situation in the world, about the globalism, about the dark forces who's actually ruling the world?
Well, I think Americans are beginning to realize that this class of globalists, a sort of self-appointed ruling elite, is backed by billions and billions and billions of dollars. And they are manipulating the political systems and the electoral process to ensure that people they select and they want to rule remain in power. We want to end that. We want to make government accountable to the population, to the people that elected them. That's our great frustration. And that's why I made the comment at the beginning that Americans are discouraged with the fact that it doesn't make any difference for whom they vote. They get the same bad outcome, the same bad policies. Things don't change. Americans are figuring it out. I don't know if Europeans are beginning to discover this. My impression is that there are growing numbers of Europeans who realize that their interests are not represented. This is certainly true in Poland and Germany, Slovakia, Hungary. I don't know if that's the case where you are in Iceland or in Sweden.
Sweden.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's definitely, like you said, we have the farmers' protests, the revolt of the farmers, and now the latest news are that the fishing industry is joining them in Europe because they as they claim, the green agenda is destroying everything for them to produce food, both farmers and fishermen. In Sweden, there's a little special situation in Sweden. I might come to that a little bit later because of the military situation. But we from Iceland, we would like to hear from you, especially comment on that, talking about the war in Ukraine. Several weeks ago, the Icelandic government decided to close down the Icelandic embassy in Moscow. What's your response to that?
Well, as a matter of principle, I think it's a bad idea, especially during crises of any kind or disputes of any kind, for a nation like Iceland or the United States to shut down an embassy inside a country with whom it has some sort of disagreement. The most important thing that you can do is keep the lines of communication open. Shutting them down doesn't solve any problems. It simply increases the probability of misunderstandings and wrong-headed action. So I hope that that's going to be reversed. I think it's a serious mistake. The problem that I see in Europe, which is to a large extent also the case here, is that the truth of what has actually happened in eastern Ukraine and in Russia has not reached the majority of people in Europe or the United States. Putin is depicted as some sort of Hitlerian figure, which is fanciful nonsense. He's not. The Russians are not on the march to restore the Soviet state system. They're not interested in that. No one in Russia, and least of all in Moscow, wants a war with anyone, specifically us in the West. But over the last 20 years, the Russians have made it clear that they would not tolerate a large NATO military presence on their borders and that they would regard it as a threat. And it reached the point in January of 2022 that they could no longer ignore it. From where they sat, they knew that NATO had planned to utilize the Crimea, particularly Sevastopol and the ports in Crimea, if they could do so. And that's one of the reasons the Russians went into Crimea to prevent that. That's historically Russian, has been since 1776, and historically was never part of Ukraine. The second point is that eastern Ukraine is populated, for the most part, with Russians, Russian speakers, people that are culturally, historically Russian, and they have been treated very badly inside Ukraine over the last 20 years. Ukraine embarked on this Ukrainianization project, where you had to abandon your identity and become Ukrainian, or you were viewed as an enemy of the state. So Russians had become second-class citizens with no rights and no access to property rights, especially for the land they owned. And all of these things came together with this massive buildup of military power in eastern Ukraine. We built a Ukrainian army from scratch with the expressed purpose of eventually attacking Russia. And the Russians were very concerned that in addition to the various biolabs and CIA stations in the country, we would inevitably try to put missiles into eastern Ukraine from which we could threaten Russia and specifically its nuclear deterrent. Putin made all of these things very clear in private as well as in public. We chose to ignore it, and we took the position that if the Russians want to come into eastern Ukraine to protect the population, we will make life miserable for Russia. We will destroy it. We will destroy its economy. We will destroy Putin, overturn his regime, and so forth. It was all nonsense. It couldn't be done. It was never possible, and it never made any sense. And here we sit 2.5, 3 years later, and what are we facing? We're facing a very powerful Russia, but a Russia that is still not interested in marching west, still doesn't want war with the West, is not threatening the Baltic states, is not threatening Poland or Romania or Slovakia or Hungary or any of this, or Moldova or any of the states on its borders. But it is now in search of security. It wants to be sure that what remains of Ukraine when the fighting ends will not become part of NATO. After all, that's what caused the war. They would like to see a neutral state emerge. And frankly speaking, when I was assigned to Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, and this is in 1997, 98, 99, and 2000, the broad view was Ukraine had a unique purpose. Its purpose was to be neutral and to provide this huge landmass that stood between NATO and Russia. We saw that as inherently positive. So did the Russians at the time. Then suddenly this decision to try and drag Ukraine in made this conflict inevitable. It needs to stop. We need an end to this. And Iceland, frankly, should play a role in helping to bring this war to a close. Instead of shutting down the embassy, the government in Reykjavik should say, what do you want? What can we do? How can we help? How can we put an end to this? Specifically because you are so far from the battle area. That's your advantage.
I agree.
Yeah.
I also want to
Agreed.
ask you a little bit about the Nazi, like you told. It's been a long time actually, this war, and people actually say, specialists, that the war actually started in 2014, and then they started to massacre the eastern Ukraine, and actually there was a genocide on these people. And they actually they admitted this neo-Nazi in the Istanbul meeting and the contract, but now it's actually they acting like they don't exist, and they constantly deny there is some neo-Nazi. What do you say about that?
The neo-Nazi, or the appearance of Nazi symbolism in parts of Ukraine, is a legacy of the Second World War. We don't have time to go back over the origins of the Second World War, but the first thing that you get as a result of World War I is Bolshevism, communism. And in the years before the World War actually breaks out inside the Soviet Union, some 20 million people are destroyed, killed. And that may be a conservative estimate. The Bolsheviks murdered millions of their own people. The Ukrainians were victims of this. And as a result, the Ukrainians viewed the German entry into the war in 1941 as a liberation. By the way, so did all of the Baltic states. So did many Russians. So did many in White Russia. We don't have time to go over it all, but the point is that we estimate that 750,000 Russians volunteered to fight with the Wehrmacht against communism. At least 250,000 Ukrainians did as well. Another 500,000 people from other portions of the Soviet Union volunteered to fight with the Wehrmacht against communism. We were instrumental in helping communism to win that war in the East, with terrible consequences for Europe. Half of Europe fell under Stalin's control and under Soviet control. And for most of the people in that region, that was far worse than what they witnessed under Nazis and Nazism. That's many, many years ago. And we all know the rest of the story. Ultimately, the Soviet Union collapses, and everyone used to talk about the so-called Soviet man and Soviet woman, this new fabricated identity. And the joke in Moscow was everyone woke up in 1992 and looked for the Soviet men and Soviet women, and they didn't find any. What they found were Ukrainians and Belarusians and Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and Finns, and so forth. So the whole Soviet experiment failed. The peoples in these countries that had lived under Soviet rule for so long were delighted to be free of Soviet and Russian influence. The Russians got out of the area, and we promised that we would not try to militarize those areas by bringing them into NATO. Well, we lied, and we did bring them into NATO. And there was no effort made by us to reduce the hostility to Russia by arguing very forcefully, this is no longer the Soviet state. These people are not communists. They're Russians. whatever you like or don't like about Russians is fine, but we in the West are not interested in war with Russia. We did the opposite. We actually cultivated the underlying historical hatred and fear of Russia with terrible consequences, in my judgment. Nowhere was that more obvious than in Ukraine. So these old symbols were hauled out and utilized, sadly, in my judgment, by the Ukrainian government, this Zelensky regime, which is a very strange organization consisting of people that are in many cases not at all Ukrainian, plus our neocons from Washington, D.C. and London and other capitals who decided to exploit this underlying historical experience. So they frankly welcomed the restoration of all this symbolism and hatred in the hopes that this would fuel resistance and hatred towards Russia. Well, it's been catastrophic. We now have over 500,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. How many other hundreds of thousands of people are wounded and will never return to normal life? How many millions have been driven out of the country is anybody's guess. But this Nazi business, of course, has exacerbated tensions in Russia because the same symbols that are seen positively based on historical experience in Western Ukraine are viewed with great fear and anguish by the Russians themselves, of course. All of these things from the communist Nazi war are symbols of hatred that should have been suppressed and abandoned. We should have demanded that none of them ever be shown again. We should have encouraged everyone to walk away from these things. We did the opposite. So while we may have claimed that we were not supportive of these things, in fact, we were. And the tragedy is that we now have a level of hatred and distrust in the region that is worse than it was 50 years ago, which is catastrophic.
So the short answer is yes, there is a neo-Nazi in Ukraine, and also there's a lot of lies and propaganda coming from the West.
Exactly.
All right.
Living in Sweden, I'm thinking about it when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in Barbarossa. The Social Democratic paper Aftonbladet in Sweden said this was the fight for freedom in Europe. And the same issue, exactly those same words are we hearing from our politicians and leaders today. They say we have to stop Putin, we have to, Ukrainian, they are fighting for democracy, they are fighting for our freedom. And here in Sweden, there is, I've been living in Sweden since 1984. I have never in my lifetime anywhere experienced such a war mongering, such a, everything is going, preparing for the big war with Russia now. Our politician, our Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, our General, Michael Biden, and our Foreign Secretary, Tobias Billström, Paul Johnson, they are all claiming the same. We have to get prepared for the Russians. And now they are talking, they are talking, we have the Baltic Sea, and we have, that's the only way by sea from the Russian, from Leningrad, out into the Atlantic Ocean. And there are talks about maybe Sweden will expand the territory of the sea and Danish, and then they can close it. I mean, is there any, has this gone too far?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's gone too far. And I think part of the problem, I don't know about Sweden, which has only recently joined NATO at a point in time which makes no sense to me since I see NATO crumbling, frankly, under the weight of this crisis. It's performed badly, and it's not going to perform any better in the future. The problem that I see right now is that the globalist elites who are ruling in all of Europe's capitals and here in Washington are all engaged in fear-mongering. They're trying to convince people that Russia is this unstoppable military juggernaut bent on conquest when there's no evidence for that at all. Those are just lies. And they are hoping that if they tell these people in their countries this often enough, they will believe it and keep them in power, allow them to continue to rule. It's sad that the Swedes are so easily taken in by it, but I don't think the Swedes are unique. The Germans are beginning to figure things out, but in Germany, where you would think more people would be willing to question the government than in most cases, They aren't in large part. They too have sort of mindlessly signed on for this propaganda campaign to believe that Russia is some sort of evil entity bent on conquest. It's not. The only thing I can tell you is that, and I have not been in Moscow since 2001, but what I do know about Russia is that none of it bears any resemblance to the description in the West. And people have got to put an end to this, because you've got a country that doesn't want to go to war. What it wants to do is business with the West. This is the real aim in Russia. And this nonsense about democracy, we keep throwing this word around. It becomes an excuse for something. No one used the word democracy more frequently than the Bolsheviks and the communists. They talked about democracy all the time, and there never was any. There's no democracy in Ukraine. It's a very much a Stalinist-like state at this point, with an NKVD called the Ukrainian Secret Police, the SBU, that is threatening people. The Ukrainian population lives in fear of its government in Kiev. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians want this war to end, and it needs to end, or Ukraine will cease to exist as a nation. And we need to stop it. We want to stop it. The Russians want to stop it. Go back to March and April of 2022, when, despite very difficult circumstances, the Ukrainians and the Russians came to an agreement. They were ready to sign a peace agreement with each other and end the war. We sent Boris Johnson in as a surrogate for the U.S. president to tell Mr. Zelensky, don't sign it. Continue to fight. You will win. You will have the entire backing of NATO, of all of Europe stands behind you. You will have inexhaustible supplies of weapons and money and troops and so forth. It's all nonsense. It was never true. But he did it. And now Ukraine is virtually destroyed. No one in Washington wants to admit the truth. No one in London wants to admit the truth. We failed miserably, and there is no chance of Europe mobilizing to march into Ukraine. Anybody who knows anything about the European forces, as I do, knows that they are simply incapable of launching major offensive operations against the Russians in Eastern Europe. We need to stop talking about it. The infrastructure for logistics, the command and control structures, they don't exist. The integrated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities that are needed for all of that, they don't exist right now. So we need to stop this, because the supposed or alleged opponent in Russia also wants to stop it. In other words, you can have peace in Eastern Ukraine. You're going to have to make some territorial arrangements that are new, but that part of the world has changed borders repeatedly over the last 1,000 years. If we go back just 300, 400 years into the past, most of the areas that we are fighting in, or the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting in southern Ukraine, were under the Ottomans. And before that, they were under the Mongols and the Tartars. We need to wake up. This is nonsense. We need to make peace. And you make peace by adapting to reality. And reality today is that Eastern Ukraine, most of it, not all of it, but most of it, is Russian. And it's going to stay Russian. We need to get on with it.
Yeah, it's very sad also about how the Icelandic government are handling these things, because actually we have been in a very good relation and business with the Russian for almost 1,000 years. It's a long time, and it was a friendly nation. And when we had the crisis in 2008, the economic crisis, the Russian offered us help, to lend us money, and also, so it's been a friendly nation and good relation between Iceland and Russia. But then I want to ask you, actually, what do you think is going to happen if the West will attack Russia? Do you think this is going to start the World War III?
First of all, I don't think the West is going to attack Russia. Okay. I think everything that I have stated about what we are not prepared to do, and the lack of forces and the lack of readiness to fight, everyone in all the European capitals know this. They all know this is true. So they can't launch any sort of offensive action against the Russians. We are certainly not going to launch any nuclear weapons, and the Russians are not going to launch any nuclear weapons. So from that standpoint, I don't think there will be a World War III in Europe. What I think is much more likely to happen, especially as you get closer and closer in the United States to the November elections, is that the people in the media and in government will stop talking about Ukraine. And that's already begun. You see that the House of Representatives has declined to this point to provide $60 billion worth of aid, assistance, cash, equipment, and so forth to Ukraine. They know that most of that money will be stolen if it reaches Ukraine, and that most of the money that will be allocated will never leave the United States. It'll just pay for more weapons and equipment here to replenish the stocks that are already down to very, very low levels. So I think nothing is going to happen. I think what we will do in the United States is what we always do when things go badly. We simply leave. And this is something Europeans need to understand. Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s told Europeans, and he was right. He said, Britain is an island and the United States does not live in Europe. Now, what did we do when Vietnam ended? And it ended very badly for us. We killed perhaps as many as 2 million Vietnamese, and all for absolutely nothing. And we simply left. We stopped talking about it. We've made a terrible mess of Afghanistan. We've created huge problems for ourselves in the Middle East, thanks to this stupid occupation of Iraq and now our presence in Syria. Every time we go into these areas, we deform the natural dynamics of the region. In other words, the normal balance of power is disrupted. We create artificial forces that normally would never be there. And then we leave, and everything returns to some sense of normalcy. In other words, it reverts to the cultural, historical mean. I think that's what will happen in Ukraine. But I think we'll just stop talking about it and we'll walk out.
Do you think it's going to happen just in the next election? When Biden, if he loses, America is just going to stop talking about it. I hope people will forget about it.
I think it's going to happen beforehand. I'm still betting heavily that the House of Representatives will not fund the package for Ukraine. And keep something else in mind. Washington is a place that doesn't do well at managing more than one major war at a time. And attention in Washington is now shifted to the Middle East. Everyone is falling all over themselves to support the Israelis because that's financially rewarding here in the United States to do so. And I think we're on the path to a major regional war in the Middle East, not in Eastern Europe at this point. So I would anticipate less and less and less attention on Eastern Europe and a drawdown of forces that are there, despite the fact that we are continuing to waste huge quantities of money maintaining forces all over the place, from Estonia all the way to Romania, all needlessly. But I think it will simply subside. And it's hard for Europeans to understand this, but we are a nation that has always had too much of everything in terms of resources, an abundance of resources, and our standard of living has been high. All of a sudden now we have a fragile financial system. We are deeply in debt. So all of these other factors are beginning to have an impact on what we do beyond the borders of our country. And remember, and this is most important for Europeans to understand, at the end of the day, most Americans, and I'm talking about 70, 80% of Americans, could care less what happens beyond the borders of their country. They're much more concerned about what happens here. So if you suddenly have to make cuts in spending, reduce spending, you reduce from the outside in. In other words, you start cutting the things that you are doing overseas. You bring back forces, you stop investing, and you invest and you focus here in the United States. And I think that's where we are ultimately headed.
Yeah.
Well, you definitely are not on the same side as the Atlantic Council, because before Putin went into Russia 22, there was an article that they claimed that the United States should go to war and could manage a war simultaneously with Russia and China. This was from the Atlantic Council.
Well, the Atlantic Council is populated by lunatics. We're not going
Yes.
to war with China. We're not going to go to war with Russia. It doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to do so. Again, I think you're dealing with the same class of people that want to continue to profit from their rule over the United States and Europe. This class of globalists, they're a catastrophe. Look at your own banking systems. Your situation right now with the euro and fiat currency is about as bad as it is with ours. We could spend hours talking about the grim economic realities and getting through what is inevitably going to be a major financial crisis for you and us. But that doesn't make any difference. The truth is that it's all hot air. We don't have the forces. We don't have the interest. You don't have the forces and you don't have the interest. And there's no reason to do it. And I think ultimately the truth will come out. I simply wish there would be greater push from the publics in Europe for the truth. They should demand an accounting. They should say, tell us the truth. You've been telling us that Ukraine is winning since February 2022. How's that worked out?
Yes, right. Absolutely right.
I want to ask you a little bit more about your new organization, Our Country, Our Choice. Is this, how many people has joined the organization right now? And are you thinking about maybe starting a new political party?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because that has come up a lot for discussion, the notion of a new party, because of the frustration with the two that we have. We're closing in on 300,000 members. We've only been around now for 6 months. We haven't even invested heavily in marketing ourselves. We're going to start doing that. But I think you will see that in the future, we will have millions of members. And I think there could be chapters of Our Country, Our Choice all over Europe. We have been contacted by people in India and Japan about it that would like to join it. We're nationalists, but we're not interested in war. We're not interested in meddling in the affairs of other people's countries. We want everybody to see reality. And the reality today is that there's no requirement for us in the modern scientific industrial world to go to war. There isn't. What we do have an obligation to take care of our people. And our governments aren't doing that. They're supposed to provide shelter and food and security. They're not doing it. We've got to do those things. And that's what Our Country, Our Choice demands. And finally, it may be once we have several million members that we can form the basis of what you're talking about, which is a new party. Because I think the other two parties are really dysfunctional. And if you look carefully at who controls the money in the United States, many of the same people are controlling both parties.
Yeah.
This is not a healthy thing for a so-called republic.
Yeah, this is what's happening also here in Iceland and Europe. Like you said in the beginning, that people, it's getting tired of it doesn't matter what they choose or left or right or Republicans or Democrats. It's all the same shit, somebody say. So it's like
25 years ago, I was really encouraged because I was talking to some Norwegian officers and I said, well, I noticed you haven't joined the EU. And they said, of course not.
Mhm.
And I said, well, I was just curious, what are your reasons for staying out of the European Union? And the answer they gave me was, well, the people in Bergen don't trust the people in Oslo. So why should the people in Oslo trust anybody in Brussels? I thought that was a very healthy attitude. I'm very big on state sovereignty. I'm very big on independence, freedom, and sovereignty for all the peoples on the planet.
Yeah.
This is when we talk about Our Country, Our Choice, that's what we stress. And I think that's why we're being contacted by people all over the world who say, listen, we want to do something like this. Can you help us? Well, right now, we don't have the financial resources to help anybody, but we'll work on it. We'll see. We keep asking the following question. Where are our oligarchs? Where are our billionaires that care about us, our country. You know, where are they? They need to step up and help us regain control of our country. That's really what this is all about. Holding people accountable that you elect. And that means that you're controlling your destiny. When's the last time anybody asked in the United States, do you want to go to, do you want to fight for Taiwan against China? Well, of course not. Nobody does. Most people don't even know where Taiwan is. Setting aside the true state of affairs over there, which is no one in China wants to invade Taiwan. Nobody in Taiwan wants to go to war with China. We need to wake up. Every time there's a crisis in Taiwan, all the banks in Taiwan shift their assets to the mainland.
Yeah.
What kind of nonsense are we talking about? In other words, get out of this war mentality and start behaving in a civilized manner. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, like you say, like in general, people just want peace. They don't want war, and like almost every war has failed. So
Exactly,
why
all the
do
wars
they want-
the wars produce worse things than already existed at the beginning.
Yeah.
And that's happened in every major war. And we should have learned that lesson in 1918. We didn't. And we've been repeating this stupidity ever since. The ideological wars should be over. There are no ideological wars anymore. We should be focused on prosperity at home and peace abroad. And if you want to be prosperous at home, you really need peace overseas.
Do you think it's
Yeah.
gonna be
Here.
possible peace if Donald Trump will win the next election, because he's talking that way that he would stop the war in 24 hours?
Well, I don't know that you can stop anything in 24 hours. It will take a little bit longer than that, because if you're sitting in Moscow, having been treated as badly as we have treated them over the last 30 years, lying to them repeatedly and then subverting their interests, they're going to want guarantees. They're not going to simply say, fine, war is over, we're all going home and live happily ever after. They want to make sure that whatever remains after this is over is neutral, not part of NATO. They're not going to lose any sleep over the current borders of NATO. Those are fixed. They'll live with that. But they're not going to live with any encroachment on them. In other words, any further advance of NATO. Again, I think the Europeans have a very important role to play in this. And I think Iceland has just missed a huge opportunity, because Iceland, both because it's small and it's distant from the battlefield, gives it an enormous advantage to act in a dramatic and dynamic way to end the war. If I were the prime minister of Iceland, I would pack my bags and go to Moscow. And I would sit down with President Putin or Foreign Minister Lavrov or all of them and say, let's talk. What do you want? What's it going to take to end this? Tell us. And we'll work through this and find a way out of this mess. That would be statesmanship. That's what we desperately need. And I'm looking for somebody like Bismarck or Disraeli, or Gorshakov, the great men of the 19th century that put an end to destructive wars and found a way forward. We need that now desperately.
Yeah, we should have more like Iceland, like talk for a peace deal, like in the Cold War, when Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, they came here to Iceland to make a peace deal, and that was a very, very good deal. So that would have been a more a wise reaction.
No, you're absolutely right. But at the moment, the people in the West don't want peace. Now, when I say the people in the West, I'm talking about the ruling class, the globalists who have enormous quantities of money behind them, who are in positions of power. We've got to get rid of them. They need to be removed. We need to vote them out. If we can't vote them out, we've got to get them out, because they're a danger to all of us. We don't want this war to continue any longer. It can only get worse from here. It needs to stop. And yes, that's why Iceland was a big success for Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. And I think Iceland could be a big success again in that connection.
Right, yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Douglas. It's very, very good to hear your calm advices, and in a manner, it goes right to the heart, bottom of the heart. And I've always felt the same with Iceland, as you say. Iceland should work for peace in the world. Instead, but they are following. They are all running after the EU, you know. And the EU is all running after globalists. But so very nice to hear your words.
Maybe I have
Douglas Macgregor.
one small last question for Mr. Macgregor. I want to ask you because
Yeah.
your name it's Irish or Scottish. Is your roots from Ireland or Scotland? Because the roots
Scotland.
here in Iceland, we have a lot of people from roots from there too.
Scotland.
Scotland. Oh, interesting.
And in fact, my Highland ancestors came from a town in an area near Inverness called Dingwald. So that's just south of you. Inverness is not very far from Iceland.
Oh, really? Okay, nice to hear. So you have relatives in Scotland.
Oh, I do. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to talk to them. We are part of a clan DNA project, you know.
Oh, yeah.
My ancestors left some time ago, and I would very much like to talk to them, but they won't release their names. I put my name there and telephone number and say, please contact me. I hear from others because I also have Mackenzies in my family and MacArthurs and McFarlands and others. But no, we come from just south of where you are. In fact, you know, the area northwest of Inverness was called Sutherland. It was called Sutherland by the Vikings because for the Vikings, it was south.
Oh, really? Wow. That's a great story. Well, if you decide to come to visit to Scotland, you're always welcome also here to Iceland, very short to go.
Well, if I ever manage to escape from the United States again, I'd love to visit Iceland.
Yeah, very welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Right.
this interview.
Right.
And I wish you good luck with your organization. I'm sure it's gonna grow and be, because we here in Iceland we feel the awakening. It started, and also in Europe it started, and people is getting tired of this dishonest politician who just making damage, no good.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so people is actually talking about we just have to clean it all out and get new people and who have wise thoughts and talking like you do. It's we pray for that.
Good. Well, good luck and God bless. Thank you, Gústaf, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so very much taking your time with us. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.